Dame i gospodo, drago mi vas je vidjeti ovdje u maloj dvorani Hrvatskog glazbenog zavoda. Tišina je zavladala apsolutna. Večerašnje razotkrivanje nam dovodi jednu od najboljih suvremenih irskih spisateljica. Uspoređuju sa Joyceom. Sve je oduševila. Njezin roman Manji smo boemi i zapravo ima veliki odjek i u europskoj i svjetskoj književnosti. Ona je osvojila brojne nagrade. Večeras je s nama Eimear McBride. Ovaj razgovor s njom vodit će njezina hrvatska prevoditeljica, dakle koja je ovaj roman fantastično, vrlo težak roman za prevođenje, fantastično prevela sa engleskoga na hrvatski, Anda Bukvić Pažin. Taj prijevod je osvojio nagradu Iso Velikanović za najbolji prijevod u prošloj godini, još jedan pljesak za Andu. Anda i Eimear će govoriti cijelo vrijeme na engleskom, osim prvih par uvodnih riječi koje će reći Anda, ali za vas koji želite pratiti to ipak i na hrvatskom, sve nam simultano prevodi Sonja Trzin-Berta. I ja bih zahvalio na potpori ovom programu Culture Island koji nam je pomogao da dovedemo Eimear ovdje u Zagreb. Hvala vam lijepa. Anda, izvoli.
Hvala Sejde na uvodu. Dobro večer svima. Sretna sam što vas mogu pozdraviti u ovolikom broju upravo na Festivalu svjetske književnosti i upravo u društvu sa spisateljicom s kojom se intenzivno družim već više od 2 godine, mnogo intenzivnije nego li ona toga zapravo svjesna. Čast mi je zadovoljstvo pozdraviti Eimear McBride i kao što je Sejde već rekao, razgovarat ćemo na engleskom, a oni koji budu trebali prijevod bit će u sigurnim Sonjinim rukama. Sonja, sretno. Dear Eimear, welcome to Croatia. You've told me this is your first time here, so I have to ask you, what are the first impressions?
Oh, it's beautiful. It's beautiful, and as I was telling you before, I saw some things that reminded me of my Catholic upbringing that perhaps connect to this part of the world.
Do you want to go into details with that, or shall we just keep it at that?
I saw a statue of Our Lady of Medjugorje, so I remember that. It's a big part of my childhood.
That Irishness that you keep mentioning also in your interviews, I've read a lot about that, and we'll also talk about that in terms of the novel. So you've written 2 novels, third on the way, maybe some more, you'll tell me about it. And your second one, The Lesser Bohemians, was translated into Croatian. And I was thinking we'd start with some reading, not just to warm up and inform the audience, but also for the audience to see how performative and how 3 or even 4-dimensional your texts are. And how beautifully you're reading them as well. I'm a big fan of audiobooks. And The Lesser Bohemians, read by Eimear, is among my favorites. And it also saved me while I was trying to decipher some of the things needed for me to translate it. So, Eimear, please.
Okay.
You picked a passage, and as a loyal translator, I will follow you in Croatian.
Well, this passage is from quite early on in the book. For those of you who haven't read it, and I'm sure you will all be reading it after tonight, it's about a young girl who comes from Ireland to London in the 1990s, and she wants to be an actress, and she's also very keen to lose her virginity, which she manages in a very awkward scene, and thinks that afterwards she'll never see the man again. But London being London, they've bumped into each other on the South Bank, and they're now walking across the Hungerford Bridge together. Up to the walkway under hulkish sky, breeze licked and nerves cracking fissures inside as he points out, Big Ben, Parliament there. Look through the grating. At halfway, he says, here's London spread out for you. In the murk, cold Thames still curling away. Lights just beginning across the city. All the stone world of it, its stone face, showing its towers and flanks and shapes, purplish in this light and grey. And I stand, strict by its great space, watching the boats till St. Paul's there, he says, the Oxo Tower, Barbican. pointing out places I cannot see, then can because he stands behind. Look along my arm. No, there. No, there. Do you see? When I still don't, he bends to see it how I see, and I see all of it then. This is the most beautiful view I've ever seen, I say. Really? Better than Naples with those boats stretched out across the bay. Ah, fuck. He remembers my lies. Sorry, those are all lies, I say. I've never been there or anywhere else. His elbow on the rail. Well, you're a surprise. What did you make all that up for? I don't know. To be interesting, I suppose. How very calculating he laughs. And I thought you believed in love. Well, I do, but love isn't what that was. True, he says, but what if I'd been a lonely soul looking for it? Are you? No, I'm not. And you're not much of a liar, I guessed. This I concede. I've never been. Oh, well, that means you're probably quite good at the acting. I quick look up to see if he's joking. He's only watching, though, and in a moment says, so, you just used me for your sexual gratification, then? Well, I say, it didn't turn out to be that gratifying, so perhaps I got what I deserved. Didn't you get what you wanted? Didn't you, I say? Well, sort of. It started out well enough, but you were hurting me, I whisper. You were a virgin, he whispers back. I'm not responsible for the laws of nature. I know that, but I thought at least I wouldn't have to see you again. Ah, well, shouldn't have shagged an actor then. But by now he is laughing, and I almost am over my chasing brain. So throw my breath to the Thames and the strange of the day as we strangers stand looking out on the city. Quiet then, but for its sound, that noise it must make for its life to go round. Slow aftershave smell of some passing man, loud of the train as it clanks behind, me watching the river, him watching me. What, I ask? You know well what, he says, and stoops and kisses me. Fresh inclination, and the blood goes up, bends me like a body, puts inside into my mouth, and we, deep and open, where is no mistake, where are only runs of thoughts of next, of kissing him in that short past, naked, and he stops. I stumble forward in perfect dazed unfurl, his breath on my hot cheek, then kissing me further, and I might fall over, but he has my arm, and we kiss like he drags me live from under the Thames, and where was all this want when I needed it? Oh, I don't care, I don't, and I could... Enough, he says. This is getting ridiculous now. Do you fancy getting something to eat? There now, legs, but disgraceful knees. All his impulses working inside out too, it seems, for even as I nod, see him almost go again for me, and I am all for that. But he turns instead, wiping his mouth on his hand, leaving me tapping the prickle of mine to trail him over the bridge.
You've been telling me when we met over coffee that you do not allow anyone to read your texts in English.
It's true.
And I can understand why, but I will take the license to read that same passage in Croatian, and I'm pretty nervous about that. Because Eimear has a trained ear, maybe not an ear trained to Croatian, but to English and to acting and everything around it. So yeah, I'll do my best. So this will be the same passage that we've heard in English in my Croatian attempt of a translation. Pločnikom pod blokovitim nebom, palucanje povjetarca i nervi cijepaju procipe iznutra dok on pokazuje Big Ben, parlament ondje, gledaj kroz rešetke. Na pola kaže, evo London rasprostrt pred tobom. U mutno hladnoj Temzi još bježi u spiralama. Svjetla taman počinju po gradu. Po tom njegovom svijetu od kamena, njegovo kameno lice, kako pokazuje svoje tornjeve i slabine i oblike, purpurnast pri ovome svjetlu, i siv. I ja stojim, zgromljena njegovim golemim prostorom, gledam brodove sve dok, tamo je St. Paul, kaže, toranj Okso, Barbikan, pokazuje mjesta koja ne vidim, pa vidim jer on stoji iza. Prati moju ruku, ne tamo, ne, tamo, vidiš. Kad i dalje ne vidim, on se sagne da vidi kako ja vidim i ja onda vidim sve. Ovo je najljepši pogled koji sam ikada vidjela, kažem. Doista, ljepši od Napulja s onim čamcima ispruženima u zaljevu. Joj, k vragu, sjeća se mojih laži. Oprosti, sve sam to slagala, kažem. Nikad nisam bila ondje, ni bilo gdje drugdje. Njegov lakat na ogradi. Pa baš sam iznenađen, zašto si sve to izmislila? A ne znam, da budem zanimljiva valjda.
kako proračunato. On se smije. Mislio sam da vjeruješ u ljubav. Vjerujem, ali ljubav to nije bila. Istina, kaže on, ali što da sam ja bio usamljena duša u potrazi za njom? Jesi li? Ne, nisam. A ti nisi baš neka lažljivica. Pretpostavio sam. To, priznajem, nikad nisam bila. A dobro, to znači da ti vjerojatno gluma dobro ide. Brzo dignem pogled da vidim šali li se. Ali on samo gleda i za tren kaže, znači samo si me iskoristila za seks i užitak. Pa, kažem ja, uživala baš i nisam, pa sam možda dobila što sam zaslužila. Zar nisi dobila što si htjela? Zar ti nisi? Upitam. Donekle. Dobro je krenulo, ali ozlijedio si me, šapnem. Bila si djevica, šapne on meni. Nemam utjecaja na zakone prirode. Znam to, ali mislila sam da te bar više neću morati vidjeti. A onda se nisi trebala ševiti s glumcem. Ali sad se smije, a skoro i ja, dok mozak galopira. Pa temzi dobacim uzdah i dan je stran dok mi stranci stojimo gledajući grad. Sve je tiho osim toga zvuka. Dok se život vrti, treba mu buka. Spori miris aftershave u prolazu. Lupa vlaka koji klopara iza. Ja gledam rijeku, on gleda mene. Što? Pitam. Znaš ti dobro što, kaže on i prigne se pa me poljubi. Svježi poriv i krv jurne uzgor, savija me kao tijelo, stavi unutra u moja usta i mi duboko i širom gdje greške nema, gdje misli idu samo na sljedeće, kako ga ljubim u onoj bliskoj prošlosti, gola i on stane, ja posrnem naprijed u savršenoj omamljenosti daha, razmotana na mom vrelom obrazu i ljubi dalje. I mogla bih pasti preko, ali on me drži za ruku i ljubimo se kao da me izvlači živu iz temze i gdje je bila sva ta želja kad mi je trebala. Baš me briga i mogla bih dosta, kaže on. Ovo postaje smiješno, jesi možda gladna? Bodrim noge, ali ta bestidna koljena. I svi njegovi impulsi rade iznutra prema van, izgleda, jer čak i kad kimnem, vidim gotovo da će opet posegnuti za mnom. I ja sam skroz za to. Ali okrene se ipak, rukom si obriše usta, dok ja dodirujem bockava svoja i slijedim ga preko mosta. I'm not going to ask you to comment on this, what you just heard. We'll do that later.
Sounded good to me.
We'll elaborate on that later. So Eimear McBride, born and grew up in Ireland. With 17, you went to London to study acting. At 27, you wrote your first book, A Girl is a Half-Formed Thing. It took you 9 years to publish it. It won the inaugural Goldsmith Prize in 2013 and 2014 Bailey's Women Prize for Fiction. So 9 years to publish it. Is this a lesson in patience, perseverance, faith in yourself and in what you do?
I think it's a lesson in foolishness, certainly, and maybe stubbornness. I think also I didn't know what else to do. It was a book that I wrote the way I felt it had to be written, and it was different, it was experimental, and because of that it was hard for it to find a publisher, and I had publishers who said, well, if you rewrite it, or if you'll say it's an autobiography, then maybe we could publish it. But it seemed to me that whether it was a good book or a bad book, whether it would get published or not, it was written the way it was written, and it had to be what it was, and I just had to suck up the consequences of that. And so I didn't write for about 3 years after that, and then my husband and I moved to Ireland, and it was sort of a moment where I had to decide whether I was a writer or not. And if you're an unsuccessful writer, are you still a writer? And I was 30 maybe at that point, and it's not great to imagine spending your life as a failure when you're 30. But I also knew that there wasn't anything I could do better. So I started to work on the Lesser Bohemians.
And your second novel, so The Lesser Bohemians, is quite different from the first one in terms of style, in terms of content, or is it not? When you started writing it, did you perceive it as writing in the similar way, as a sequel, as a continuation?
No, I mean it's not. It's not a sequel. It is connected. I feel all my work is connected. There's certain themes. That A Girl is a Half-Formed Thing is a book about trauma and putting the reader in the moment of trauma. The Lesser Bohemians is a book about the life after trauma. One of the things it's about is about this life after trauma and how people make lives for themselves again. And it begins, Lesser Bohemians begins in a similar style to A Girl is a Half-Formed Thing, that it's quite fragmented, it's an internal sort of modernist monologue. But as the book progresses and the character changes, the language begins to connect up and become more lyrical.
And language is always the first thing that is mentioned in connection to your writing. It's the first thing that comes to mind when one talks about your texts. And you're compared to Joyce, not without a reason. And Joyce was a great influence for you. I couldn't avoid this question. So could you comment on that maybe? Where are you and Joyce? Where is it that you started and where are you now? Maybe that's a good way to put it.
Yeah, I think that is a good way to put it. Yeah, I mean, I think reading Joyce or reading Ulysses when I was 25 was the complete game changer for me. It was the book that suddenly made me realize that everything that I had previously thought fiction was or had to be wasn't so. That actually you could write anything you want in any way you want if you can make it work. If you kind of put in the time and if you have the skill to do it, you can do whatever you want. You are free within the context of all fiction. And that was a huge moment for me. And also it was Joyce's kind of writing about Finnegan's Wake, about with his patron saying, you know, that there is a huge part of life that can't be spoken about in straightforward grammatical language, that gets lost. This kind of part of you that immediately experiences something. The minute you have to try and put it into words, it becomes more generic and becomes less personal. And I realized that that was the perspective that I was interested in writing from, really from the guts rather than from the brain. And so in that way, Joyce was a huge influence for me. And I think his presence is very strong in the first book. I think by the time I came to the Lesser Bohemians, it was something that was more absorbed, that was kind of there, but in a much more passive way. And also at that point, I think I had started to fall out of love with the great male ego as well. Because, you know, Joyce is very much about putting man at the center of the universe and connecting him to all things that have been and ever will be. And actually, I'm interested in going and taking the reader on a different journey of really trying to be as intimate with them as it's possible to be, of trying to connect with them on a level that is completely under the skin, that is not literary and that is not intellectual or is not academic, but is visceral and personal and emotional as well, but that's not the most important part.
And maybe this is also a good time to mention that you are a trained actress and you're training in method acting.
Yeah, that's right. So I, you know, a little like Eileen in the Lesser Bohemians, went to London to the Drama Centre, which at that time was the only school in London which taught the Stanislavski method. And that was, you know, it's kind of a laborious training for an actor, I think, but actually for a writer it's a very, very interesting way to think about character. And character is really what I'm interested in. I'm interested in people. I'm not interested in intricate plots. I want to dig into people. And so that taught me how you build a person. How you, all the things that you need to think of if you're trying to create a whole life and a complex way for people to interact with each other, that you can't, it's not just about what people say and how others react. It's about all the things that are happening in the body at that moment. So now that I'm sitting here, I'm thinking about answering your question. thinking about my head's a bit itchy, and thinking about all these people here, what are they thinking of me? And then thinking, I shouldn't be thinking what they're thinking, I should just be thinking about what I'm thinking. But all those things are happening at once, at the same time that I'm talking, and that's the way life works for people. And so I really wanted to find a way to make language express that urgency that we all feel, even when we're not aware of it. There are just so many things happening to us and inside us.
And we do not think in finished sentences.
Exactly.
Right.
You know, if we all thought in linear sentences with a capital letter at the start and a full stop at the end, how slow would life be? Nothing would ever get done.
Exactly.
Slow,
but easier to translate when you put it like that.
Yes. Selfishly, that was not at the forefront of my mind.
Yeah, of course, and it shouldn't be. It shouldn't be. When I first started working on your book, it felt to me like I was missing a lot of pieces. And then you told me that this 320 pages long book was once 900 pages long. So how did it go from 900 pages to 300 or around 300?
Well, I think it took me a long time to understand what was happening in the book and to understand the two main characters. And I suppose maybe that method training drew out the whole process for me, and I felt like every time someone sneezed, I had to describe it and the impact the sneeze had on everyone else in the room. And, that gets very sort of long, and that kind of built up to this kind of 800-900 pages. And at the end of that, I suddenly thought, okay, now I've written the biggest sketch for a novel that anyone's ever written, and now it's time to write the novel. And because I knew that I understood the characters now, and because I understood them, I thought the reader doesn't need all this detail. They don't need all this stuff that I needed in order to understand them. And so I can just get rid of that. And so then I went back to the beginning, and my rule was, if I don't remember this, cut it. If it's important, I'll remember it when I get to that page. If I look at it and think, well, what's that? Gone. That's it. And so that's how it got cut down.
That's very interesting in terms of memory, and also maybe this is also a good time to mention that I avoided the contact with Eimear a long time because I thought I will now work on translating, and then I will need her to fill in some gaps, to explain some things, because if all of a sudden I contact her and she tells me, you tell me that I got it all wrong, oh my God, what am I going to do with the 200 pages that I have translated? And then I asked you about, I remember it was specifically a name of a bookstore, Dylan's, right? And then I found, the name that I found on the internet was not written in the same way in which it was written in the book. And then you explained it's a mistake, but it also isn't, because your rule was, if you remembered it like that, you leave it like that. Doesn't matter that the things have changed in the meantime.
Yeah, because the book is not, it's not a work of history. It's not there to describe to people how it was in 1994 in London. It's there to give them the understanding of how it was for those characters. And in order for that to happen, I decided to base the London that she experiences on the London that I knew. So everything that's in that book, I don't know if it's historically accurate or not, but it's what I remember. It's how I remember it. And I felt that, in a way, I had to allow, memory has its own truth, and I had to allow it to have that. And then memory can be inaccurate, as we all know, or it changes as time goes by. And so it seemed more honest to do that than to go back and meticulously research. It makes no difference to the reader. And the London that they get is the kind of, is my beloved London as an 18-year-old.
So if London were destroyed, nobody would be able to reconstruct it.
Well, I mean, this is the famous quote from Joyce, was that if Dublin was wiped from the face of the earth, it could be reconstructed stone by stone from Ulysses. And I think if London was wiped from the face of the earth and they reconstructed it from this, they would get the London that I remembered, not the London that was.
So two most memorable things for me as a reader, not as a translator, are passages where Eilidh and Stephen together or on their own walk through London. So everything that goes on the streets in London. And sex parts. So shall we talk about London a
Or
bit
sex.
more, or sex? You pick.
Well, since we're on London, let's go on London.
Let's go on London. I've seen, and maybe you told it, that this is a very panoramic book. A lot of things are going on at the same time, and it takes the space and the time and everything. And it's been described as a love letter to London. So was that the initial impulse that got you writing this book and got you into it, or was it something else?
No, that was the beginning, because I had just moved back to Ireland for my husband's job, and I hadn't really wanted to leave London, and I felt very homesick for it. And so I started to write about London, and then to write about that London that I had known. And from that, the characters started to emerge. And so, yeah, it's certainly the kind of love letter to that time and place. And I think London is absolutely the third character in the book.
Now the sex part. In Croatia, reviews were rave, and some of them said, yes, it's very experimental, it's tough, but stick with it. You get to understand it as you go by, you get to understand the method, and there is a lot of sex. So this was a part of the reviews.
Yeah.
So my question is, did you have the intention at first to write about sex that much, or you just wrote your way into it?
No, I certainly didn't start off writing thinking, well, there's going to be a lot of shagging in this book. And when it started to occur, I just, my sort of Irish Catholic self, oh no,
That
your mother's
Irish
going to
part.
read this book. Don't write all this in it. And so I felt very uncomfortable. But of course, for me, writing always has to come out of discomfort. It
Okay.
always ends up having to be about something that I really don't want to write about. And so I started writing the sex, and I'm thinking, why am I writing all this sex? This is a bit weird. But then I realized that actually it was about character development, and that what I was really interested in was using it as a way for us to better understand the characters, and that it's a very interesting kind of way to look at someone. So, for instance, in the first scene, you learn so much about them. You know that she's 18, he's 38, she's a virgin, he's very sexually experienced. She's arriving into the scene thinking, okay, I want to lose my virginity, and she's not going to tell him about it. She's determined she's just going to get it over with. He thinks he's just going to have a kind of a fun one-night stand with this kind of slightly mouthy Irish girl. And so they sort of begin, and as it progresses, it becomes very clear to him that actually this is her first time, and that she's quite scared, and then she gets very sort of embarrassed, and then he sort of melts, and he tries to help her and tries to make it a good experience, but then she gets so embarrassed by herself that she's actually very rude to him, and then he's very unpleasant to her, and then it all just ends with this kind of, oh my God, cringing sort of awfulness. And you understand so much about who those people are, who they were before they came into the room, and what kind of people they were underneath it by the way that they interact. And so by the time they get to the next sex scene, it's changed again, because they've already had this kind of accidentally intimate interaction with each other. And so every time they have sex, they're bringing something else into the room, and that it just seemed to me that you knew more about them at the end than at the beginning, and that was kind of the rule.
Yes, and the sex is also about their communication, because they sometimes do not have any other means to communicate.
Yeah, because neither
that.
of them are people who are particularly comfortable with talking about their lives, talking about their pasts, and particularly him. And in a way, it's how they learn how to trust each other, so that by the time they do have to talk, they have built up a kind of a bond through the body, and that kind of supports them through the next kind of difficult, okay, now it has to be said out loud phase.
And now back to the language again. We talked about it. People were for a long time forbidden to talk about sex and to write about sex. And as a consequence, maybe, of that and other factors,
the vocabulary, the register which you use to talk about sex is pretty limited. So how did you go around that, or what was your method, if it were any?
Yeah,
with
well,
that?
that was the thing. When you start to write sex, and then you realize you're going to be writing a lot of sex, you realize how small and pathetic the vocabulary is available to you, and that is definitely because of obviously generations of censorship. And then also the kind of sex that got written was lots of, you get this very sort of bombastic Henry Miller
Exactly,
kind of
yeah.
patriarchal kind of woman as animal kind of writing, which is just so excruciating. And so I thought, okay, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm not going to allow myself to use any sex words. Because it's always the same: pumping, thrusting, grinding,
yeah.
all the, the kind of very phallocentric words about sex. And I just thought, okay, I have to find a completely different way around. And also the fact that when you're having sex, you're not just thinking, I'm having sex the whole time. You're responding to what's happening. You're looking at the person, you're hearing them, you're looking around the room. And there are kind of odd things that occur to you. So you're like, oh my God, look at that stain in the shape of a dog in the corner of the room, and then you're back in the moment again. And, there's so many things that happen, and we like to think that it's just kind of this moment where everything's taken over and we forget everything else. But really, that's like 1% at the end. All the build-up, you're still there. You're still a person. You're still a separate being. And I really wanted to just kind of capture that and how those things, how people interact when they're in that kind of vulnerable, enthusiastic, might go great, might go badly phase. And, I just wanted to make it feel human. And also, there's so much writing, and particularly with male writers, there's a lot of self-disgust about sex. And, okay, sometimes it's not great, but actually most of the time it's pretty good. And then sometimes it's amazing. And I really wanted to just capture a more human and more humane way of writing about sex. That it doesn't have to be exalted and it doesn't have to be disgusting, that it can just be a human experience, that it's like this, it's like this.
And you captured that wonderfully, and I'm not saying that as your translator, but as a reader, because that's what translators are, first and foremost, the readers, passionate ones and long-term ones. So I really loved those parts and the way you did it. And also people asked me whether I was embarrassed to translate those parts, and I said not at all. I enjoyed it, and one of the reasons I enjoyed it is because at first those were the only instances where I was sure what you were talking about and writing about. So this was a pretty, I couldn't wait for the next scene of that kind to come. So it's good that there was enough.
There was a lot of them.
There was a lot of them, but none of them is the same as you explained, and the reasons why that is so. Now I have to talk a bit about the translation and the translating process. People also asked me whether I contacted you, and as I started off by saying that I did, and I said just a couple of times, and it was a couple of times, but when I was going through our email correspondence, there was like 250 questions that I posed in those couple of times. It was like, dear Eimear, here's some 50 questions, and then you would answer, and then, dear Eimear, it's another 65 questions for you. So in all honesty, not just with me, but with your other translators, is there a point where you think, oh my God, who are these people, and what is it that they are going to do to my book?
Well, yes. No, I mean, to be honest, I was very glad to get your questions, and they always made sense to me.
Oh, thank you.
That's a relief. I think when you get a question, I mean, I did once get a question from a translator who just went, this is a typo, isn't it? I mean, it's not a typo, it's supposed to be like that. And then I was very worried, but your questions were always very kind of precise. And it was interesting for me to have to be precise myself, to have to think about the book in a much more technical way, and how it was done and why it was done that way. So I quite enjoyed the process, and I have to say I am always in awe of my translators, because I know that it is a terrible task.
In one of those emails you said, and I remember that sentence, maybe I should take up a more straightforward writing style. That was maybe just a footnote. You were not serious, I hope.
Well, you know.
in an attempt to unpick all those moments that I asked you about. But in general, how does it look like with your other translators from other languages? Do you cooperate a lot? Do you just wait for them to contact you? Do they contact you a lot?
Yeah, I think it really depends. I mean, some translators like you will send a lot of questions, and slightly unnervingly, I've had some translators not contact me at all, which I really don't like, which I think is odd, because, you know, as I was saying to you before, sometimes like English language readers will just say, what?
Yeah.
What was that bit about? So how someone can work on it in a different language or turn it into a different language, without asking, I don't know. And I did have one translator who shall remain nameless,
of course,
who didn't contact me at all, and then I was doing an event like this with her, and we had a cup of coffee beforehand, and she got the book out, and she said, I always wanted to ask you about this bit, it was on the first page, and I think it means this. And I went, no, that's not what it means at all. Yes, I have a horror when I think of that translation and what may be going on inside it.
Yeah, it makes me think it's the afterlife of the text that Walter Benjamin talks about when he talks about the task of the translator. So for you, it probably means that at one point you need to let go and not bother about the author's vision versus translator's version of it.
Well, you know, I think luckily for my sanity, I understood early on that writing a book and translating a book were two very different skills, and that given that I don't speak any language well enough to translate it myself, I had to trust that the publishers would choose the right person for the job, and that person would understand their own process well enough to ask a lot of questions, ask a few questions, to do it whatever way they wanted. And I think you just have to let go, because otherwise you would be crazy just thinking about it all the time.
Exactly. So many afterlives of your texts.
Well,
who would catch up? Tell me about your working routine and writing process. How do you, you get up in the morning and you sit and you write for 8 hours?
Obviously, you know, with the sort of the 9 years it took me to write Lesser Bohemians, that varied somewhat. You know, I had a child, and I finally had the other book published and had to do touring and everything with that, so it varied. But certainly with Lesser Bohemians, in the early, maybe first 4 years of writing, I would work anywhere between kind of 6 and 16 hours a day on it. And, you know, I was a mad woman, essentially. I, was completely antisocial. Luckily, I had a very understanding husband who was just like, okay, woman, go to your room.
Go and work.
There's no point in trying to talk to you now. But now, you know, obviously I have a young child, so it's slightly different. And I work probably from about 10 o'clock every day until 4 or 5, depending. And I'm, when I'm working on fiction, I'm pretty good. I'm not a procrastinator. It's not, I don't have to sit and make myself go through it. I'm not looking on the internet all the time. When I'm doing other kinds of writing, then I find that much harder, and I'm much more distracted, or ready to be distracted.
But you are a pretty analog person. You said that for yourself, that you try to stay away from all the digital presences and identities.
Yeah, well, I'm not on any social media, and I think that helps. And I have about 3 websites that I know how to look up, and I don't really surf things, and I just I respond to emails, and that's about it.
And why are you not on social media? To preserve privacy or sanity?
There's probably. I think it's. Obviously there is the notion of privacy, that I don't want, people contacting me all the time, and I don't want that distraction from my work. And also, I'm not I'm glad when people like my writing, but I'm not really interested in hearing their analysis of it on a tweet. It's just, and I think that's a difficulty for a lot of writers I know who are on Facebook and Twitter is that they have to put up with a lot of crap as well. There are always a lot of people who think that their opinion is that you must hear it. It's not enough that they have it, but you have to know about it, which isn't always that helpful. Which isn't helpful at all in the writing process, and especially when it's something you've already written. You're like, well, I hope you like it, and if you don't, too bad.
Too
You
bad
clearly
for
have
you.
terrible taste.
Now that you mentioned taste and literature, Joyce is always mentioned together with your name, and you've said that he was and has been a huge influence, but what about other influences, or let's not call them influences, let's call them writers that you read, have been reading, respect, like, female, male, both?
Well, I think the playwright Sarah Kane has always been very, very important to me.
She's in the book as well, right?
Yeah, she shows up. Well, you see,
Yeah.
the book is also filled with, because I knew that it was a book that was, about love in a lot of ways. I really wanted to kind of fill it with things that I loved. And so Sarah Kane gets in there,
Tindersticks
gets in
Nick
there,
Cave.
Nick Cave gets in there. There's, Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet
Marlowe.
gets in there. There's, Christopher Marlowe. There's all sorts of things just get a little passing mention. And that was, just wanting to create a sort of ballast of, I don't know, maybe I'm superstitious. I think if you love something, then that kind of communicates itself through the text.
It
Even if
does.
you're not explaining it,
It does.
literally to the reader. So Sarah Kane was a big influence on me, because I think when I first started to read her work, I kind of understood that I had carried all these very old-fashioned prejudices inside myself, completely unaware of it, about ideas about how a woman should write, what was
Okay.
suitable for a woman to write about being angry, about writing in a brutal way, and not being apologetic about it, and not feeling you had to make everything all right. And I hadn't understood. If someone had said to me, "Is that what you think?" I would have denied it. But I clearly did have it, because I realized that I needed to just get rid of all of that and to write, to put myself as the writer in an uncomfortable, compromising, slightly, in a position where the potential for humiliation is very high, and that I'm not interested in writing unless I'm putting myself on the line, unless I feel like I'm taking a risk. And, to write a book like The Lesser Bohemians that has a lot of sex in it, of course you put yourself in a position where it's one of the easiest things a writer can be humiliated about, is writing about sex. And particularly women writing about sex and trying to write about sex in a different way is, creates a lot of antagonism with male critics. Not with female critics, funnily enough.
Of course, yes.
And I think it was really Sarah Kane, that feeling of, okay, go a bit further, go a bit further. Okay, now you're feeling comfortable, go a bit further. And now you're feeling scared, go a bit further again. And I think that's the kind of writing I am interested in reading, and that's the kind of writer I am interested in being, and in a large part because of her.
Any other writers? What are you reading currently?
I've been reading Garth Greenwell's new novel. I don't know if anyone's read What Belongs to You, his first novel. And again, he's a writer who I feel a lot of kinship with. He's young American writer who's spent a long time living in Bulgaria. And his first novel is about an American who comes to teach English in Bulgaria and hooks up with a male prostitute in the public toilets, and begins this very complex relationship, which is part transaction, part actual relationship, and he's never quite sure where the boundaries of it lie. And he's a really interesting writer and writes very interestingly about sex, and very unusually, I think, for a male writer, kind of delves into the psyche in a way that feels very revolutionary to me. So I've been reading his new novel, which I got an early proof of just before I came. And similarly, he's a risk taker.
Risk-taking, is that something that can be connected to the role of literature today for the writer or for the reader? What I'm trying to ask, I guess, is can your writing be defined as a new direction for literature?
I suppose in some ways perhaps it can, but it's also something that comes from a tradition. You know, my writing and my interest in language, and it comes out of that, you know, very strong Irish modernist tradition. And you know, I think there's no point in claiming that you've arrived and you're the first person on the moon. You know, all writing comes from somewhere. I think my writing differs, or is maybe going somewhere else, in that I decided to go back to that tradition, which had really been closed down since the 50s, you know, maybe with the exception of Beckett. It was kind of seen that modernism was done, that it had nothing left to offer. And I really disagree with that. And I also think that modernism is a boys' school, maybe with the exception of Virginia Woolf.
Virginia Woolf, yeah.
It's kind of it's the boys' club, and actually there is no reason for that. And modernism and its kind of attack on the way we think about ourselves, on the way that we understand the world as a fractured place, is actually a very powerful tool for women writing, and particularly for writing about the female experience and the female bodily experience. Because, you know, to return to that conversation about sex and vocabulary, women have so little language available to them. I feel as though we have to reinvent it for ourselves, that we have to create it for ourselves, and we have to take those spaces that we've been told we don't belong in. And there's no point in trying to play the game with the establishment. We must just go in our own way and do our own thing. And I feel that's what I'm trying to do. And so in that way, it is something new, I think.
What do you feel is the role of literature in general in today's society? Very digital, very social media based, very impassionate.
Yeah, I think it's funny, I'm supposed to be not here, I'm supposed to be at home writing a lecture about the importance of the modern novel.
I didn't know that.
So nobody say anything about that. It's something that I've been thinking about a lot the last week as I procrastinated over that and then came here. And I think that it is the antidote to the modern world. I think the novel is different. We don't need it for the purposes that people needed it, say, in the 19th century. We don't need it to communicate historical details. We don't need it in order to have a discussion about politics. We don't need it in the way in the 1950s and all the men with their swinging dicks in the US were writing the great American novel about the state of the nation and all that. We don't need it for that anymore. All those things are discussed more quickly and more readily and more democratically online.
More explicitly also, yeah.
Yeah, online. I think that what the novel can do that nothing else can do is really to think deeply about what it is to be human. And that is the big challenge of the digital age, is what is it to be human? And the novel allows space for that, and it allows complexity, and it allows you not to have a 140 character answer. And it can be open-ended and it can be awkward, but there's nothing that allows you to see the inside and the outside in the way that the novel can do. And I think that's what it has over everything else. And it allows you time to digest the world and to digest what it means to be a person in the world. There is no time left anywhere else anymore.
That's true.
But the novel still has that and can do that better than anything else.
And your novel did it better than most novels that I have read, if not the best from all that I have recently read. So can we please hear another passage from it?
Oh, thank you. Well, I'm going to read a very short passage. And if there are any fans of Irish literature in tonight, there's a little bit of plagiarism of Yeats's To a Child Dancing in the Wind at the very end. And if there are no fans of Yeats in, that's okay. Then I never said anything about plagiarism. So this happens just kind of towards the last third of the novel, and the two characters have sat up all night and had a long night of talking. Could I grow up in a night, grow up in this day, curled here with him on his small bed, in the cradle of our arms and wrap of our legs, watching him deep in his deep dream, far the threat of what he's been while I lie here, in love. So much, and sooner than I thought I'd be, years off I'd thought, and not like this, but I have come into my kingdom where only pens and pencils were, abrupt and all abrupt. No longer minnow in the darkness and the deep. Through the portals and currents I've been, going to the surface, up into the sun. Touch my own throat, his long arm, shining like a body, come fresh into the light. And she is in the center of life. I am her. Not unspun either, for what can it mean more than how a life was lived? His breath gone peaceful in the tight and warm. Twin mind to his, in different dreams, I hope, and list in their pooling through the dark, across books and wine glasses over my bags, contenting us, while across the world she lies, his girl, who is not me. Does she love him like I would if he were mine, that way? That other way I do not want. Tie up your long hair that the salt drops have wet. Being young, you have not known the fool's triumph, nor yet love lost as soon as won. No, that's wrong. Only one here, not lost at all. And dread? Won't any more. For bound to him is what's to bind. And as for crying, for the wind.
I have two more questions on my list. One of them is the one I won't ask you. And you agreed that we won't talk about that because women are always asked that same question. How do you combine career and writing and your creative efforts? How can it be that you can have a family and still write? So we won't go there. I completely agree with you that that narrative is terribly sentimentalized, and it always goes in this direction that only women get to answer these questions, men almost never. So we'll just take that away from my list. And the other one is, what are you working on right now? I've mentioned the third novel. Is it a novel? Can we call it a novel?
We can call it a novel. It's
yeah.
a very short novel. So yeah, I've just finished that. It's called Strange Hotel.
Great title.
And it's a book that's set in 6 different hotel rooms around the world, one of which is in the character's imagination, a hotel room that she imagines. And it's kind of surrounded by lists of hotels around the world where this character has stayed. And I have to say, knowing that I was coming here, Zagreb has been added to the list of hotels. So you're enshrined in the next book.
And that is coming out February?
February, yeah.
Okay. And I've read somewhere, and you mentioned it also before, that the Lesser Bohemians is supposed to be the first part of a trilogy. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's the plan. I think by the time I got to the end of the book, I realized that actually I was still really interested in those characters, and that actually, having gone through all the years of creating them, they still embody a lot of what I'm interested in writing about, and how they change and what happens next. So that's the plan. Is there will
Is there a plan to transfer this novel to any other media, on stage,
to the film?
Not on stage. It has been optioned as film script, but who knows? Those things take a very long time, and I'm hoping it comes to fruition, but who knows?
We hope as well. And one last question, because we are unfortunately running out of time. One thing that I forgot, but that interested me a great deal, is the poetry in your novel, The Lesser Bohemians. I've listened to you talk about poetry, comparing it to prose, and an interesting thing, you will tell us what you thought about that, about the demands from the reader when one reads poetry and when one reads prose. But I immediately, when I read it the first time, I knew that I will be going back to poetry, which I hadn't read for 10 or 15 years. And that was poetry, so lyrics, not lyrics, but all the lyrical forms by Croatian writers, because I realized that I needed Croatian poetry with its syntax, vocabulary, and the perception of the world. So I'm interested in what you think about that, poetry in your own work and the demands it puts on the readers.
Yeah, well, I think it's kind of a strange one, because I'm not really a great poetry reader myself, and haven't been for many years, and people often say that they find my prose very poetical, and I think that's because I'm interested in language and because I am interested in rhythm and rhyme as well.
I've noticed.
Yes, I remember once having a conversation with the Irish writer Colm Tóibín, and he was talking about teaching his students and saying to them, well, you know, the first rule of writing prose is that you must never have a rhyme. I'm just thinking, oh God, I'm
What
done.
did I do?
But I think I feel jealous of poets. I feel envious of the attention that readers are willing to bring to their work. And when a reader goes to a poem, they don't expect it to give itself up immediately, its meaning and its deeper meaning immediately. They expect that they have to bring something of themselves to that experience, a level of concentration and an openness and a willingness to understand rather than just be spoon-fed. And it seems to me that kind of attention has been decided that that's not appropriate for prose anymore, and I disagree. I want it back. And so I've written books that sort of demand attention, which, you know, causes me no end of trouble with people going, what's going on in this book? Why is it so hard to read? But I think when people give it a go and they give it 10, 15 pages, usually they say that it just clicks and they understand how it works and they can kind of give into it and just let it be what it is. And I think there has been such a movement towards social realism in prose writing in the late 20th century, and this kind of worship of, you know, people like Hemingway, who just sort of pare it down and pare it down and pare it down, has in a way destroyed a lot of the pleasure for prose writers and for prose readers. And you know, and Hemingway is great, but there are an awful lot of really terrible writers who think that they're doing what Hemingway did, and it's created a sort of a tedious style which is just reproduced everywhere. And I think readers are adventurers. Readers are not couch potatoes who just want to be spoon-fed from the TV. They are willing to open a book, go to buy a book, open it up, sit down and go through the effort of reading it all. Why not give them something? Why not give them something different? Give them something that kind of allows them to be the best reader that they can be as well. You know, when we're children, we take such pleasure from conquering a book. When you're a child, the first time you finish a book, it's the most extraordinary feeling, and you haven't understood every single word, but you've understood enough to get through the whole thing, and the satisfaction you get at the end is huge. And I don't think that goes away when you're an adult. I think anyone who's ever read Ulysses, they'll say, oh my God, It was torture, but no one ever goes, oh, I wish I hadn't done that. What a waste of time. That doesn't happen. Anyone who gets to the end of a difficult book, they're glad that they did. It's an achievement.
So thank you for giving that experience to readers, to translators also, and thank you for coming here. It's been a great pleasure. Hvala
Pleasure's
vama
mine.
što ste došli i hvala Sonji što ste ovo izvedila.
Thank you.
Edna O'Brien.